Howdy folks, welcome to chapter 6. This week we're learning about learning in the introductory psychology videos. My name is Gabriel Sines once again, and the topic, the underlying idea here for the learning chapter is going to be that learning happens a lot more subtly than a lot of you may notice or be aware of. In this GIF here, we got a dog who figures something out. Really, it's not a great image about learning, but we're going to be seeing a lot of dog-related videos and examples because training dogs is actually one of the best ways to study how learning happens. Not just learning in humans, but learnings in all beings with brains. And it might be a surprise to you, but the majority of the learning that we do as humans actually occurs in the exact same way that it does for dogs and other animals. And if we know how it works for them, we can actually engineer the learning for ourselves so that we can improve our own lives and improve the lives of our loved ones. So let's get started. For this week, we've got 4 sections of material. The first 2, operant and classical conditioning, are going to be the kind of basic types of learning that living beings naturally perform kind of constantly. Operant and classical conditioning, or just conditioning in general, is kind of the learning that you achieve without you purposefully learning it. It's a type of learning that we have evolved as not just a species, but as a whole, a genetic pool. So anything with the brain really learns through conditioning. The higher order brains, like mammals, can learn more complicated forms of conditioning, can learn more amounts of conditioning, but just about any living thing that has a brain can learn conditioning. And even conditioning can happen in really, really small basic animals like flies or bugs or bees. We'll also learn about reinforcement schedules, which has to do with how you teach the learning affects how quickly learning happens, and it also affects how quickly learning is forgotten. And in some cases, you want to teach quick and forget quick. Sometimes you want to teach slow and learn for a very long time, forget slow. Finally, we'll talk about cognitive learning. Cognitive learning, that last section, is going to be really the learning that you and I normally think of when we talk about learning. It's going to be the learning that happens from talking and listening and interacting and observing. Excuse me. Okay, so let's define learning in psychology. Learning is any way in which our experiences give us a lasting change in behavior or information that can affect our behaviors. So anything that really changes you as a person counts as learning. And you have to think about this. So for example, if I drop my keys on the floor, does that count as learning? Well, the keys aren't performing any new behavior. It's not affecting me in any way, but there is information there. The information of, well, the keys were on the table and now they're on the floor. And so that, you can consider that a type of memory, and we'll learn more about memory actually in the next chapter. But if you have memory, a lot of times if you have memory, you have learning. For example, let's say that you worked really hard and you get blisters on your hands, and you get those eventually turn into calluses. So are your hands getting more tough a form of learning? You can say yes, and you can say no. So no, because they don't really have a brain, but also yes, because as a living organism, they have adapted to the experiences that they've received. They received experiences where those cells need to be harder and stronger than the other cells on your skin, and so maybe they've found a way to be harder and stronger, and they've taken an experience and changed their behavior. Associative learning is the most basic form of intelligent learning. It's learning that 2 events or 2 things are connected to each other, or that 2 things happen at the same time. So in this picture here, we've got a lightning cloud, and so when you see lightning, you then experience thunder, and the thunder is scary to you because it's loud. So then, because lightning and thunder always go together, you might start being afraid of the lightning because it gives you the fear that the thunder gave you. And so this is the associative learning there. You associate lightning with fear because you associate lightning with thunder. Stimulus is any event that or situation that evokes any sort of response in a person or that affects you in any way. We just needed to define that for bookkeeping reasons. So let's talk about conditioning. Like I said, conditioning is kind of the most basic form of learning. Whenever dogs are learning things, you are conditioning them over time. And what does that mean? Well, you can think of conditioning as kind of like weather conditioning or shampoo conditioner. Well, the idea of conditioning is that over time, experiences affect you in a permanent way. So your weather conditioning prevents your porch wood from being damaged by rain, and your hair conditioning, over time revitalizes your hair. In psychology, conditioning is, how a dog learns that the four-letter word WALK means that it's about to have a nice, fun time. It's about to go outside. It might have a chance to run around, and it's going to have a great time. So, one moment. Excuse me. So, when your dog is first introduced to the word, to WALK, and I'm going to avoid trying to say it so I don't startle any dog owners that are listening to this on their phone. You'll notice that they don't understand what the word means. They don't know what the W word means. But over time, your dog will learn that that word means it's about to go have fun. And I've included a video here where you'll get to see a bunch of dogs' reactions to that word. And I want you to pay attention as you're watching that video. Pay attention to the ways in which the dogs react to the word walk. Yeah, how do they react to the word walk? Go ahead and give that a watch, and I'll wait here. So go ahead and pause. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so hopefully you've seen the video and you've noticed what the dogs are doing. Of course they're excited, and of course they're very cute, but what are they doing? Well, they exhibit a lot of the behavior that they would for going on a walk. Maybe they go over to the owner to get leashed up, or they go to the front door so they can leave. They run and jump around so that they express the same behavior that they would express when they're on the walk. So it makes sense that there's this association between the word walk and going on a walk because they know what it means. Now, it's not as if dogs know how to speak English. It's not as if they really understand the word walk or the idea of walk. They just know that that sound is associated with going on a walk. And if you've ever trained a dog, or if you want to train a dog, you'll quickly learn that when you issue commands, they need to be words that are clearly differentiated. And in fact, if you want to issue commands, a lot of times it's easier to issue commands based off the way you move your body or with a particular tone. So a lot of people use clickers to issue commands or whistles. And so if you want to teach your dog to walk, you want to make sure that you use the same tone. So if you want to teach your dog to come, that's the most valuable thing you can teach your dog, to come to you on command. You want to make sure you consistently use the same tone, or spin around, or lay down. You always want to use the same tone and make sure that the words are clearly differentiated, because what they're doing is they're making the association between the sound and the activity. Now, I've got a picture here from, well, maybe I shouldn't tell you. Do you know what this movie is from? I got a picture here from, that's right, it is from Little Shop of Horrors, a dentist, and it's kind of a terrifying situation because, most people are afraid or dislike going to the dentist. It's not really a fun activity. Part of the reason going to the dentist is not fun is because there's a number of things that are uncomfortable about going to the dentist. As a kid, it's an unfamiliar place with people who are dressed up weird. You really don't go there to have fun. You really go there to have your personal space invaded, to have things going on in your mouth that you don't really understand, and that you have no choice about. And going to the dentist can be painful. And so it makes sense that people would naturally learn to associate the dentist with just negative feelings. And there's a lot of people that actually have very strong anxiety associated to going to the dentist, to the extent that they need to take medication, anxiety medication, before they go. But when if we want to improve the existence of dentists and dentistry, we may need to figure out a way to create a situation where going to the dentist is a positive experience. So of course some dentists, they'll give you a treat, they'll give you lollipops, children's dentist's office will be decorated in really pretty ways. It may be that going to the dentist needs to be kind of like going to a good pediatrician. Is that the right word? A children's doctor? So when I remember I had my children's doctor, I developed kind of a relationship. He was a friend. He would explain what he was doing and why he was doing it. And so having a good understanding of what was going on and why it was happening, and the fact that it's for my benefit, and that he really cared about me and my health, and he had empathy, and he was interested in whether or not I was feeling pain or discomfort, that made it a much more positive experience than it could have been. And so maybe dentists can do that moving forward to try and reduce the fear association and create more of a care association. Here's an unfun fact. Dentistry is actually one of the careers with the highest rate of suicide, and that is actually in part because dentists have to deal with, well, people don't like going to the dentist. So, to come back to the starting point, conditioning is a very basic form of learning. It's the learning of associations, and it can be positive or it can be negative or it can be neither. So positively, you could learn that walk means you're going to go have some fun outside. Negatively, you can learn that to be afraid of your dentist, and you can have just a bland, unexciting conditioning as well. So let me know if you can think of a situation where something makes you think of something else, but it doesn't really have any positive or negative connotation to it. That's a great way to do your exit slip today. Or if you can just come up with anything that makes you think of something else without it really necessarily making sense. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first section of material here, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is all about learning with rewards and punishments, and like I said, we're really going to be focusing on dogs here. So operant conditioning can be defined in a couple of different ways. One way is the changing of behavior by the changing of consequences, learning by punishment or reward. And so here we've got a dog that's obviously pretty dang well trained. When you're doing operant conditioning, desired behaviors are reinforced. So if your dog does something that you like, maybe you give him a treat, maybe you give him love and cuddles. And if they do something that you don't like, you can punish that. And it's important to know that rewards and punishment are both different types of reinforcers. Reinforcers being something that changes behavior in a specific way, either increases or decreases the likelihood of that behavior happening. So we can see that either through some combination of rewards and punishments, this dog here has learned to not take the treats off its nose and just wait until it's allowed to do that. What a good boy. So how does operant conditioning work? Well, you have some desired behavior. Say, for example, you want your dog to come to you when you say, come. And what you do is you reward that behavior whenever it happens. And so if you pair the desired behavior with a reward like a treat, eventually what's going to happen is that the likelihood of that behavior will increase. Your dog will come to you more often, more promptly, more quickly when you shout or yell or say, come. Partially because of the reward, but partially because what will happen is it'll start to associate coming to you with a positive feeling. And so you can start with a treat and then move on to just rewarding them with pets and cuddles, and then eventually you might be able to get to a place where they'll come to you regardless of whether they get a reward or not. Okay, so of course we can also punish behavior to reduce it. So if there's an undesired behavior like your dog barking at just any sound outside your door, then what you can do is reinforce it through punishment, and once you pair those things together, you will get a reduction in that undesired behavior. So an interesting way that you can pair these together, let's say that you don't want your dog to bark anytime there's someone outside because that's annoying, but you do want them to come to you if there's someone outside, and maybe put their paw on your foot or something to indicate there's someone outside, there's noise outside. So what you can do is punish them if they bark with like a spray bottle or just negative tone of voice or some responsible punishment, and you can also reward them for doing the alternative response, which is to come to you and do the paw. So you can kind of you can pair these. You can use multiple forms of operant conditioning simultaneously to achieve learning in a stronger or quicker fashion. So I've gotten here on the slide a link to a video. Please go ahead and watch this video. This is an Ed, Edd n Eddy video, a cartoon, one of my most favorite cartoons from some time ago. And the boys here are being taught manners, table manners, using a system of punishment. So I think it does a perfect job of exemplifying operant conditioning. Please go ahead and give that a watch, and I'll come back here and think about what you learned. I'll give you 3 moments to do that. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I think that video does a wonderful job of presenting learning. But let's move on and talk about a couple of different subcategories of rewards. First, we've got primary reinforcers. A primary reinforcer is something that you or your body needs to survive, or for kind of as a basic function. So that includes foods such as, and not just food that you need like vegetables, but also candy. Makes sense that like ice cream is not necessary for life, but it's a very powerful reward. That also includes things like sleep and sex, really anything that your biological functions benefit from having. Next up, secondary reinforcers are learned reinforcers. So they're not things that you are inherently liking of, but that you may have already learned to like. So you're not born liking money, or you're not born liking good grades, but it makes sense that money and grades can be rewards because you've learned to have that positivity to them. And so if you think about secondary reinforcers as something you can teach based off of something you've already learned, it makes sense that you can string learning together so that you learn based off something you learned, based off something you learned, based off something you learned. You get really complicated chains of reward. But ultimately, all rewards go back to some sort of important bodily function. To make a couple notes here, let's think about social rewards. So if someone tells you good job, is that a primary or a secondary reinforcer? Well, it's somewhere in between. It's sort of primary because as people, we need social interaction. We need validation, we need to have good self-esteem, but it's also secondary for a couple of reasons. For example, we might not really die without that social praise, but we probably wouldn't live a very great life. The conversation, words, are things that we have to learn, so it's not something that directly affects our body. So I would say that social reinforcers are things that might be somewhere between primary and secondary, kind of depending on the particular situation. If you think of other types of social reinforcers like affection, like hugs and sex, those are social reinforcements, but they are also very physical. Remember that we learned that the sense of touch is very strongly associated to your emotional development. It makes sense then that physical forms of affection, like even just a hand on your back, can act as a primary reinforcer, whereas a verbal form of affection, which is kind of the same sort of affection, would be slightly less primary. So, if you want to try and think about a question for your exit slip for today, maybe try and answer the question: what is social reinforcement? Things like being told "good job," or or having people clap for you, are those primary or secondary? What do you think? There's not really a perfect answer there, so go ahead and give it your best opinion. So this other two set of reinforcements, called positive and negative reinforcements, denote whether you are introducing or removing stimulus from the participant's world. So a positive reinforcement is where you introduce something new. A negative reinforcement is when you take something away. And it's important to be aware that positive and negative do not mean punishment and reward. That's something that's really easy to confuse. So on this next slide here, I've put together a couple examples so we can practice these different types of reinforcement. So we've got rewards and punishments, and we also have positive reinforcers. So let's take a look. Positive rewards: candy, extra credit, and being healthy. So they're positive because they introduce stimulus like candy or extra credit. They're rewards because they're desirable things. If you get candy for doing something, you're probably going to do that thing more because you like candy. So next up, I'd like, as we go through these examples, for you to think about: are they primary or secondary? So take a moment here and think about, is candy a primary or secondary reward? It's a primary reward because it's food. Extra credit. Extra credit is probably going to be a secondary reward because it has to do with your grades. It's not really something your body inherently craves. And being healthy. Being healthy is an interesting one. It's definitely going to be a primary reward, but it's not going to be a particularly strong one because being healthy is a subtle reward. When you do exercise, you don't suddenly feel healthier, but you instead feel healthier over time as you do exercise consistently. So it's not necessarily one of those powerful primary rewards like most of them are, but there are direct benefits to exercise associated with being healthy. For example, when you exercise, you might get those endorphins, and that would be a more direct form of primary reward there. Okay, so positive punishments include parking tickets, getting scolded, and getting extra chores. Parking tickets, of course, are positive because you are introducing a new thing, something you're not normally affected by. Parking tickets, are they primary or secondary? They're definitely going to be secondary, right? Because they cost you money, or maybe you get in trouble, and those are things that are not directly associated with your bodily needs. Getting scolded is going to be kind of that social thing, so maybe somewhere between primary and secondary. And getting extra chores is definitely going to be secondary because chores are not something that you need for life functions. If you want to think of a positive punishment that is primary, since I didn't really include one there, think about tasting something bad or receiving pain. For example, your body punishes you for doing dumb stuff with pain. If you exercise too hard, you're hurting all day next day. And people who are aware of proper exercise regimens know that you want to exercise to a point where you can exercise consistently without getting too much pain from it. So if your exercise regimen makes you hurt, maybe slow it down and ramp up more slowly instead of going all out at the beginning and burning out quickly. Okay, so negative reinforcers. Remember that these are things that take away stimulus, but they do act as a reinforcement, either as a reward or a punishment. Stopping your baby's crying, getting parking tickets waived, and not having to take a final. So all of these things are something that take something away, but they're rewards because losing that thing is nice. For example, most folks don't enjoy hearing crying babies, and it's the reason I put that there actually is because it's an interesting phenomenon. Imagine you have your toddler and they're chucking a fit and they're crying at Walmart. Okay, so what do? They want candy, you give them candy. They stop crying, and suddenly what's happened is a simultaneous form of learning that is really bad. What do I mean? Well, if the kid is throwing a tantrum and they get candy, you are rewarding them for throwing tantrums. So maybe the tantrum stops in the short term, but in the long term, you are teaching them that tantrums should happen more often because you're rewarding them for throwing a tantrum. The other side of that, too, is that, well, you don't like them crying at Walmart, and so you giving them candy is rewarded by the ceasing of the tantrum. And so you are creating a cycle of learning in yourself. If you reward the child with candy for having a tantrum, you're rewarding yourself with peace and quiet for giving in to their demands. And what do we do with terrorists? We do not negotiate. There are much better ways of handling this, but you can do punishment. But so what sort of punishments work there? A lot of people instinctually think that maybe they should hit their children. That's not really a great idea. There are other options like threats, say I'm going to take your Game Boy away, or I will give you a reward if you are good, so only reward them not doing the tantrum instead of giving them something so they stop the tantrum, and that way the framing of the reward is very impactful. Another thing you can do is to just take them outside. Let them cry it out while they're not bothering anyone. You're wasting their time and your time, but if they're going to chuck a fit, do it where it's not bothering anyone. Sit on your phone and wait for them to be done. Make sure that they're aware that you're paying attention to them, but you're not going to play their game. So there are a number of ways you can deal with that. Another thing is, like I said, you can pair teaching of a positive relationship instead. So try and get them to focus on, say, instead of throwing a tantrum, tell them, okay, well, look around, see if there's anything on the floor that you can put on the shelf, or anything that's in somewhere it doesn't belong. Or look around and see if you notice something that you don't know what it is, and try and figure out what it's for. And so figure out something that they can do instead of throwing a tantrum, and reward them for doing that thing with whatever you like. It could be the candy that they wanted, it could be a toy, money, whatever. The point is that instead of focusing on the tantrum, you could get them to focus on a different behavior, right? Something that's beneficial. Okay, so let's get back to our practice here. Is stopping your baby's crying primary or secondary? That's going to be a secondary reward because it's not really something that your body needs, but it's a very clear secondary reward because crying's not a fun thing to listen to. Getting park tickets waived, that's going to be, that's right, a secondary reward. Good job. And finally, not having to take a final is a very clear secondary reward as well. By the way, this class is organized such that if you do a good job, you don't have to take our final exam. There are 150 points available in the class. Each test is worth 25 points. So by the time you get to the final, you might already have a 90 or 100 in the class. And there's no averaging, there's no weighted grades in this class. You just add the points together. So if you've already gotten your A by the end of the semester, I don't need to give you permission to skip the final. I can't affect your grade. You already did everything that you need to do. And the reason I did that is because I really want to reward you for learning and learning consistently throughout the semester instead of cramming and studying for the exam, because I want you to remember this stuff and I want you to feel as though you've gotten a wide introduction to psychology instead of forcing a number of things down your throat. So take that to heart. If you haven't been working hard in this class so far, do it so that you don't have to do the final. I promise that this is no game at all. You know, if you did all right on your first test, it's actually possible to get an A in this class having just taken one of the exams and skipping the other two. Okay, so finally, negative reinforcers that are punishments. Remember, negative reinforcers are things where you take stuff away. So, for example, having your Game Boy taken away is very clear punishment and a negative reinforcer because you're losing stimulus. That one worked on me pretty often. Excuse me. Allergy season. Okay. Getting no dessert or losing your dessert. That's a negative reinforcement because you're losing something, and it's a punishment because you don't like it. But is that primary or secondary? That's going to be a primary negative punishment because dessert is food. Finally, losing your driver's license. That's going to be a negative reinforcer because you lose something. It's going to be a punishment because you don't want to lose your driver's license. And it's also going to be a secondary reinforcer because driver's licenses is not something you need for your body. Part of the reason I include that example is that I'd like to raise the point of who loses their driver's license. Of course, if you get DUIs or if you have too many dings on your license, you lose it, and you should be punished for driving poorly or for driving while intoxicated. But another group of people that loses their license are older adults. Say that their vision's going, their memory's going, their attention span is going, and as they get older and older, you may get to a point where you are no longer capable of driving safely. Now, the thing is, if you are a good citizen, if you care about other people's lives or your own life, you will turn in your driver's license when you don't think you can drive safely. However, losing your driver's license, losing your ability to drive, is a punishment. So we, in this case, punish older adults for being good citizens, which doesn't make sense. It makes sense that older adults would avoid turning in their driver's license, would avoid being a good citizen, because we're punishing them for this. So it may be more intelligent to find a way to reward older adults for turning in their driver's license if they do not feel they can drive safely, or if tests result that they do not feel they can drive safely. Say maybe by giving them a tax break or giving them I don't know, just anything to reward people being good citizens. Our society can be designed in a way that you are rewarded for being a good person, but we do need to use intelligent design in the way that our government works. And so this is one example of something that we could improve. So how do you feel about primary versus secondary rewards, primary versus secondary reinforcers, positive versus negative reinforcers, and rewards versus punishments as reinforcers? I hope they make sense to you, but I understand that there's a lot of combinations there. So I've put together a bit of practice here so you can see if you remember these different types of reinforcers. You're not going to be required to identify reinforcers on the test, but I hope this can help you remember what each one of them actually is. So let's get started. A student who usually skips class and wants to start going to class more often decides that they will have some chocolate every time they go to class. So what sort of reinforcement is that going to be? Let's go through the answers from bottom to top. Is it a secondary positive reward? Well, it's definitely not secondary because chocolate is food. So it's also not going to be a secondary negative reward. Is it a primary positive reward, or sorry, a primary positive punishment? It's primary because chocolate is food. It's positive because you're introducing something new. But it's not punishment because chocolate is nice. So A is the best answer. That's going to be a primary positive reward. Next up, your roommate always steals your soda. What type of reinforcement would locking the fridge be? This one can be a little bit tricky. If you'd like, go ahead and pause now. See if you can come up with the answer on your own. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's go through the answers. A, is locking the fridge a primary positive reward? Now, so this is interesting. Is it primary? You are preventing them from getting to food, drink in this case, So it could be primary. It could also be secondary because you are removing their fridge privilege. So it could be primary or could be secondary. What about positive? Well, you're definitely taking something away here. So it's not going to be a primary positive reinforcement, and it's not a reward, right? It's definitely a punishment, so it's not going to be B either. Is it a secondary negative reward? Well, it could be secondary. We talked about that. Is it negative? Yes, it is, because you're taking something away, either taking away the soda or taking away the fridge privilege. Is it a reward? That's not quite right, because this is not a reward, this is a punishment. So the best answer is going to be D, a secondary negative punishment. Okay, you think public speaking is really scary, so you decide to go to a poetry night and recite some poetry for friends and random people at the cafe. Which of the following would be a positive secondary reward? Let's go through them. Or I'll give you a chance to pause here, see if you can come up with the answer. 3, 2, 1. Now let's go through them. Free coffee for participating. Is it positive? Yes, you're introducing free coffee. Is it secondary? No, coffee is food, but it is a reward. Getting laughed off stage. Well, that's very clearly punishment. It might be primary or secondary because it's social, but it's definitely going to be a positive because getting laughed off stage is something that you don't normally experience. You're introducing the laughter into your life. C, the audience clapping for you. Is it positive? It is, because clapping is not something you normally experience. It's something that's adding to your life. Is it secondary? Maybe, because it's social. Is it a reward? That's definitely a reward because people like being clapped for. So C is probably going to be your best answer there, but let's take a look at D just in case. Getting slapped every time you sow fear. That's going to be positive because you don't usually get slapped. It's going to be primary because slaps are pain. And it's going to be a punishment because slaps are not very fun. So C is going to be your best answer there. And that's it for the practice. We'll see some more practice in the rest of this chapter 2 just because we do have a number of these combination ideas. But let's go ahead and move on and learn about classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is another form of conditioning where it's an older form of conditioning, an older form of research and learning, where you learn to associate or connect different stimuli. So have you ever heard of Pavlov's dogs? Pavlov's dogs is is kind of the titular example of classical conditioning. If you don't know what they are, or if you're not familiar with this image, it might look a little scary, but it's really not too bad. Here's how it works. The dog is restrained, but comfortably restrained just to keep it in place. Those harnesses actually hold it up so it doesn't get tired of standing. And the dog is placed with a tube in its mouth, and usually its mouth is closed with rubber bands or something. Not painful, maybe a little bit annoying, but the reason for them is so that the tube collects all the saliva in the dog's mouth, and the amount of saliva can be read by a machine. And the reason you're reading the amount of saliva is because you're reading how ready to eat the dog is going to be. It makes sense that if food is in front of you, if you're getting ready to eat, your body will produce more saliva. And so this machine was designed to read how well the dog had learned something. The idea was that the more it salivates, the more it knows it's meal time or it's about to eat. And Pavlov tried to teach its dogs, or his dogs, to associate eating or food with ringing a bell or shining a light. So what they would do is they would present the food to the dog and shine a light or ring a bell every time the food was presented. And over time, the dog would learn that the bell meant food. And you could actually track how much the learning had happened by the involuntary response of the dog salivating. Okay, so we've got another image here that kind of shows the same thing, but it starts to show the same thing in the terms that we use when we talk about classical conditioning. We're going to learn about the US, UR, CR, and CS. Let's start here at the top left. In classical conditioning, you start with a US and a UR. The US is the unconditioned stimulus, the stimulus that naturally affects you in a certain way. So food naturally makes you salivate, or it makes the dog salivate. So the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation is the unconditioned response, UR. Okay, so this is a basic mechanism that our bodies perform without our control. And what's going to happen in this teaching, in this learning, in this conditioning, is that you're going to try and teach the dog that the tone of a tuning fork is food or associated with food. So what's going to happen is every time the dog is given food, you hit the tuning fork so they hear that tone. And eventually what's going to happen is the tuning fork is going to become a CS, a conditioned stimulus. That means that the dog has learned to react to it in a certain way. Its reaction is going to be the CR, the conditioned response, meaning that they have learned to salivate to the tuning fork because they associate the tuning fork to food. So to run through that again, US, a stimulus that naturally causes some response. UR, the natural response, the unconditioned response for that unconditioned stimulus. CS is going to be what you learned to associate with something else, the conditioned stimulus, and CR is going to be the conditioned response, the way in which you're supposed to respond to the CS. Note that the UR and the CR are the same things. They're both salivation in this case, so that the CR has really more to do with being a response to a particular conditioned stimulus. Okay, I hope that made sense to you, but if you feel like a lot of stuff is going on, that's okay. We'll see a couple more examples of this information so that it'll make more sense and you can kind of hold all of it in your head. So here's a kind of an overall slide explaining the information we just went through. What is classical conditioning? It's the creation of conditioned-based learning through the associations, through novel associations, using by pairing the unconditioned stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. I'm not sure if I misspoke there. By pairing the unconditioned stimulus to a conditioned stimulus and trying to get an unconditioned response to turn into a conditioned response. So I've got a couple of videos here that will show you classical conditioning happening in what are called Skinner boxes. So Skinner boxes come from a scientist named B.F. Skinner, who was kind of famously the one who made these contraptions that were designed to classically condition animals, to teach animals to do certain things. So in the first video we'll see a bird that has learned to peck or to turn around, and they're rewarded with food. So it is kind of operant, but it's also classical because they learn to associate the word with a certain response. So it's kind of both. And something you'll notice in this class is that classical and operant conditioning are two forms of getting conditioning learning to happen. But when you learn one way, you also learn the other way. And we'll see those examples later on. But go ahead and go watch both of these videos. They're not particularly long, but they do a good job of showing you how those conditioning-based learnings can happen. I'll give you a moment to pause here and watch the videos now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so here's a Skinner box. This is the visual. It's a visual diagram of the second video we just watched. There's a number of components to these Skinner boxes that can be used to teach animals things, kind of both by operant and classical conditioning. You have a speaker to emit noises, lights, a lever that the animal can press. Food can be dispensed here, so a reward can be dispensed, but also this floor here can be electrified to create a punishment. So you can teach the animal pretty complicated forms of learning using this Skinner boxes. Okay, so we're going to walk through here how learning happens in classical conditioning. One more time, we're going to try and do this visually. Remember that by pairing the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus together, you're hoping to get an unconditioned response to turn into a conditioned response. How does this happen? Well, normally an unconditioned stimulus results in an unconditioned response, and you want to create a conditioned stimulus result in a conditioned response. So how do we do that? Well, let's start with an example here. Let's say that this example comes from a professor that I had. This is the most memorable example for me. He would go on road trips with a friend of his, and when he went on those road trips, one thing he started doing was he started conditioning his friend. What he would do is blow a puff of air into his eye. So the unconditioned stimulus is to blow a puff of air into his friend's eye who is driving, and that would result in his friend blinking. So it makes sense that blinking is a natural response to receiving air puffs into your eye. The thing is that what he would do is every time he'd puff that eye, he would also go boop. And so every time he would go boop, whew, blow air into the guy's eye, resulting in blinking. And by pairing the unconditioned stimulus, the air puff, with the conditioned stimulus, the boop, the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response relationship became a conditioned stimulus, conditioned response relationship. So it got to the point where even when he didn't blow air in the guy's eye, the person would blink whenever he said boop, which is kind of annoying, but a very clear example of how you can learn to associate, how you can be conditioned to associate boops to blinking through classical conditioning. So, like I said, classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both forms of learning. They're very powerful forms of learning. If you want something to differentiate the two, you can think about how in classical conditioning the learning is happening involuntarily. So in that previous example, the driver was not choosing to learn boop equals blink or boop equals boop equals you're about to get puffs of air in your eye, but instead they were forced to learn that. So it's classical conditioning is going to be an involuntary form of learning. Operant conditioning is going to be a voluntary form of learning, because remember, operant conditioning is all about reinforcements and rewards and punishments. So if you don't care about the reward or punishment, you won't ever learn the thing you're supposed to be learning. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here in this section of the video is practice classical and operant conditioning by watching a couple of videos. So go ahead and give this video a watch, and as you're watching it, I want you to think about, is this classical or operant conditioning? I'm going to wait a moment here so that you have a chance to watch it. Ready? So 3, 2, 1. Isn't it a really cute video? There's a number of videos like this. Feel free to watch all of them if you like, and you can say that it's for your college class. You have to watch cute cats doing cute things. So is this classical or operant conditioning? This is going to be a pretty obvious example of operant conditioning, because the cats are being rewarded for ringing the bell. They get food when they ring the bell. Now, can you think of a way that this is also a classical conditioning experience? I'll give you a moment. This is a great one to use for your exit slip today. Can you think of a way in which these cats learning to ring a bell for food could be classical as well? Well, when they hear the ring of the bell, they're probably going to associate that with food. When they hear the ringing of the bell, they might think of food, they may want food, they may expect food. So when they learned this operant conditioning, they also learned classical conditioning as well. It's interesting how that works, isn't it? We've got another example here, another video. This is a video from one of my favorite movies, Terminal, with Tom Hanks. If you're not familiar with the movie, it's wonderful. I really encourage you to watch it. But what's going on in this video or in this movie is that this gentleman is stuck in an airport. He is not allowed to leave. He doesn't have any money, and he doesn't have any friends, and he needs to eat just like any other living being, and so he needs to figure out a way to obtain food, or at least obtain money so he can obtain food. So once again, as you're watching this video, think about, is this classical or operant conditioning? Give it a watch. Think about your answer. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this is a pretty good example of operant conditioning as well. Is there any difference between him learning to push carts for quarters and the cat's learning to press bells for food? There really isn't. And so it makes sense that we as humans learn through these conditioning systems in the same ways that animals learn, and these are very powerful conditioning systems. Can you think of a way in which this can be classical as well? So he probably gets to the point where the carts, looking at the carts or driving the carts around, makes him feel good, makes him feel like there's food coming, makes him feel like he's about to be rewarded. So there could be a classical association between carts and eating, because he eats whenever he does the carts. So there you go. It can be kind of both at the same time, but usually you're going to learn in one way, but the conditioning happens regardless. And so because conditioning is kind of universal, it can be both operant and classical. Regardless of how you got there, you end up with both kind of inevitably. Okay, so I hope that was an interesting section for you. This is the last thing in this section before we finish off the video. We're going to talk about a couple of different ways in which conditioning can be beneficial. My favorite one is this machine here in the corner. What this is I think it was a Swedish invention or Italian invention. I don't remember. I'm sorry, I forget what country this flag goes to. But what this does is when it receives a cigarette butt here in this kind of trash can thing, it spits out a bit of food. And this contraption is designed to teach birds to clean up public spaces of cigarette butts and small pieces of trash by encouraging them with food. So this is a pretty clear example of operant conditioning. They get rewarded for turning the trash in, but it's also kind of classical because they would associate the machine and cigarette butts with food, so it's kind of a bit of both, but definitely more operant than classical. And this is a very effective machine. It turns out that when they put it on I think they put it on a boardwalk, it resulted in a clean boardwalk within a day, and there were reports of birds coming in from miles and miles away to participate in it because the birds would talk to each other about this machine, and they say, hey, you want lunch? Go do a bit of work. So it's kind of interesting that we could kind of engineer animals to work as public servants by feeding them. Clever bit of engineering there. So what other ways can we use conditioning, or can conditioning benefit us? Okay, so of course pet training is a valuable form of conditioning. Survival is an interesting form of conditioning. So think about this. If you are a mouse and you're foraging for food and you don't know what food is good or bad for you, how are you going to find out what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, what's poisonous and what's healthy? Well, what mice actually do is, if they're not sure they can eat something, they'll eat a little bit. They'll just have a nibble, and they'll wait a while. And so mice have a very fast metabolism, and if they just wait 20 or 30 minutes, they'll know whether that thing makes them sick or whether it doesn't make them sick. So this is kind of how they learn whether plants are good for them, different scraps are good for them. This is partially why it can be very difficult to get rid of mice with poison traps, because they will just take a little bit of the poison. They'll just have a teeny nibble, and that might not kill them. It might just make them sick, and they'll learn, well, let's not do that again. They won't eat a lot of the poison enough to get them sick. So of course that works for people as well. We'll actually talk about that, an example of that later on in this chapter. You can engineer situations where conditioning teaches people to be better people. Like talked about the driver's license thing with older adults. If you ever get tailgated, tailgating is when people drive very, very close behind you. And so a very simple way to deal with tailgating is to just slowly slow down. Don't brake check the person, but slow down a little bit. So if they want to go faster, they will learn that hanging out immediately behind you is not very beneficial. And worst case scenario, you slow down. If there's no way for them to get past you by slowing down, you will eventually clear that space. But another thing too is that if you're going really slow, maybe you should move out of the way. So tailgating is bad, but if you're in the left lane and you're going slowly, that's not a good idea either. You should probably move into your right lane. So tailgating can be conditioned for or against the person who's doing tailgating. Last one, or sorry, not last one, there's a couple more. Phobia treatment is an interesting way that we can use conditioning. So do you know what a phobia is? A phobia is an intense and irrational fear. For example, you might have a phobia of dogs, and so even just having a dog walking across the street on the other side of the street from you might make you freeze, it might make you feel uneasy, it might make you feel nauseous. So if you have a phobia of dogs, let's talk first about how it comes about. Why do people get phobias? Most phobias come from some form of conditioning. For example, when I was a little kid, I had a very big Great Dane who was taller than me bark in my face, and that was really scary, right? I didn't like that. And so for a very long time, I was conditioned to be afraid of dogs that bark. It would really make me very uneasy. So how do you deal with that? How can you treat that? Well, if conditioning caused the problem, conditioning can also solve the problem. Let's say, how do you know of any way to get over an irrational fear? Exposure therapy is something you may have heard of. That's where you are exposed to the thing you're afraid of, but in a way that's safe, so that eventually you are not afraid of it. So if you are afraid of dogs, and even looking at a dog makes you feel uneasy, maybe you can look at pictures of dogs in a safe, comfortable environment with a loved one next to you, so that you get comfortable looking at dogs and not feeling scared of them. And then maybe you can move on to having puppies. Playing with the puppy, and you learn that puppies are safe, puppies are not dangerous, they're cute and good guys. And so you can learn that maybe dogs aren't so bad that way, and eventually you can move through a series of conditioning steps to hanging out with dogs and knowing that dogs aren't bad and that barking isn't bad. It's just, something that exists in the world, and through conditioning you can unlearn that phobia. So last one here, pain and recovery. I briefly mentioned this before. Pain is your body's way of teaching you what to do or what not to do. So an interesting example here is that there are a lot of people who develop shoulder, neck, arm, and hip or knee pain over the course of their lives for various reasons. And a lot of time the treatment for that is not to treat the problem, it's to treat the symptoms. So a lot of time the treatment for shoulder or knee pain is to get these injections that reduce the pain in your shoulder and knee. Now, your body is designed to feel pain so that you treat that knee and that shoulder with a little bit more gentleness. And so if you get these injections that make you not feel pain, what's going to happen is you're going to work with those shoulders and knees as if they're perfectly fine, and you will damage them further. And so what will happen is over the course of the next year or a couple of years, you will get those injections, but when they wear off, you'll be feeling perpetually greater and greater amounts of pain because you are hurting your arm because you are ignoring the pain, your body's way of teaching you to be careful. So when your body is feeling pain, pay attention to it, listen to it. It is trying to tell you something most of the time that you might learn from. Okay, so that's a good place to stop here. That's about an hour-long video. We've got about halfway through the material, and I think the second half of this material is a little bit shorter than the first half, so hopefully we'll finish up that next time. But I hope you've enjoyed this material. There's a lot of interesting things that we can learn about this, and next time we'll learn all about birds and slot machines. So have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and take it easy.